faithfully delivering value by interpreting great books from around the world.
Hi, this is Sally speaking about books.
Today, the book I'm interpreting for you is called Distinction. Before talking about this book, let's first discuss a hot topic online at the end of 2020. Group buying socialites. Here's what happened. A netizen claimed they spent 500 yuan to join a Shanghai socialite group on WeChat. This group promoted itself as a place for local Shanghai socialites to exchange information about luxury goods and to date and dine with people of the same social class. But after some observation, this netizen was surprised to find that in this so-called socialite group, a 3,000 yuan per night Riverview room at a 5-star hotel was shared by 15 people, each paying only 200 yuan. To prove they stayed at the hotel, the 15 people in the group actually took turns wearing the hotel bathrobe for photos. Besides that, they also pulled money for other things like a several hundred yuan afternoon tea, where each of the 6 socialites only paid 85 yuan. The most exaggerated was the luxury brand stockings. These could also be pulled for and then passed around among them. Let's put aside whether this story is true in detail, but it has attracted widespread attention. It's worth discussing. If this WeChat group didn't use the term socialites and honestly called itself a luxury group buying group, it probably wouldn't have gotten any attention. So the key point lies in the contrast between socialites and group buying. So-called socialites originally refer to beautiful women from prestigious families, talented and attractive, who frequently attend fashionable venues. Well-known socialites we know include Lin Huiyin and Zhang Ailing from the Republic of China era, and today, the daughter of Macau's gambling king, Pansy Ho, and Paris Hilton, great-granddaughter of the founder of Hilton Hotels. These people were born with a silver spoon, upper-class women, while those socialites in the WeChat group are undoubtedly the most ordinary people around us. These women called themselves socialites merely to satisfy personal vanity. But going further, no one can deny that improving one's social status is something everyone dreams of. Group buying socialites actually reflect a more universal and widespread social phenomenon, where ordinary people tend to improve their social status by buying luxury goods and frequenting high-end venues. Now, I see. Then we can't help but ask, why do people behave this way? Beyond personal vanity, are there more important and universal social reasons? This book, Distinction, helps us answer this question really well. The author of Distinction is Pierre Bourdieu, a late French sociologist. He, along with Britain's Giddens and Germany's Habermas, are called the 3 giants of contemporary European sociology. Bourdieu introduced a key concept in the book, cultural capital. With that, the core idea is that social classes are distinguished not just by economic capital, but also by cultural capital. Cultural capital shows through what we call taste, and it influences our social status more subtly than economic capital. Well, in the group buying socialite story, these women work hard to improve their class status, hoping to boost their cultural capital by owning luxuries and going to high-end places. But improving cultural capital isn't simple. It's not something an Ivy League diploma or a Hermes badge can fix easily. The behavior of group buying socialites is unlikely to achieve their original goals. Next, I'll build up step by step, starting with 3 questions to interpret the main content of Distinction. First question, what is distinction? Second question, how is distinction formed? Third question, what does the existence of distinction mean for our society? First, let's look at the first question. What is distinction? In the group buying socialite story, we've already got some intuitive feelings. For example, places like 5-star hotels distinguish people from different classes. Luxury brand bags distinguish the rich from the poor. But Bourdieu points out that the difference between rich and poor isn't true distinction. The core is taste. Distinction is the difference in taste. Being poor is okay, but being called tasteless Doesn't that make you angry and embarrassed? Let's think about it. Is the so-called chain of contempt really about comparing who has more money? Of course not. For example, take milk tea that costs around 20 yuan a cup. Why do many people prefer drinking products from viral brands? Or go to viral brand stores for their products? Here, it's clearly not about whose wallet is thicker. Also, in the so-called chain, where British drama viewers look down on American drama viewers and they look down on domestic drama viewers, is it really that British drama viewers are richer than domestic drama viewers? Even more so, no. Behind all this, it's still taste at play. So we can't help but ask, what exactly is taste? Why are we so obsessed with showing off our taste? In the opening paragraphs, Bourdieu analyzes the importance of taste as an activity that demonstrates human aesthetics for everyone. Simply put, what makes humans different from animals, besides using tools, is that we have culture. Culture isn't just about knowing how to read or do math. It's about humans creating art, represented by painting and music. It can be said that art is the highest symbol of human spiritual activity, symbolizing human superiority over other beings, full of spirituality and creativity. Therefore, in Western philosophical tradition, aesthetic ability is revered as human spirituality or nature. And at the philosophical level, this spirituality and nature are not only innate, but also fairly bestowed upon everyone. However, Bourdieu sharply points out that so-called taste and aesthetics are closely related to social class, especially one's family background. Taste, or aesthetic ability, is never disinterested as philosophers believe, nor purely based on personal talent. Instead, it's shaped by social factors like family and education. To illustrate this point, Bourdieu cites numerous social surveys in the book. These surveys cover various social classes and occupations in France, tallying the cultural leisure activities and household expenditures. The time frame spans from the late 1960s to the early 1970s.
A typical example is the 1972 survey by the French National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies on 13,000 families. You might have guessed that each social class has its specific tastes. Oh, what?
But Bourdieu summarized some particularly interesting patterns. First, the higher the social class, the more their aesthetic taste emphasizes form over content or function. How should we understand this? Once it circulated online, how to make a French feast. For a French feast, the bigger the plate, the better. The smaller the food, the better. In other words, the first point, a dish isn't for eating, it's for looking at. Their function of filling the stomach isn't important. What matters is their visual brilliance. Although these formal aspects are somewhat joking, they vividly illustrate the pattern Bourdieu discovered. Well, why does this happen? Bourdieu explains that the middle and lower classes consume for functionality, which is why ordinary people always seek value for money and pursue direct sensory pleasure in aesthetics. For the upper class, they have long moved beyond material needs.
Therefore, they take pride in non-utilitarian delayed gratification and sometimes even deliberately pursue suffering.
These so-called highest tastes are tastes that don't discuss utility.
Here, Bourdieu has an interesting survey. He showed people from different classes a photo of an old, wrinkled hand, then asked subjects to describe their understanding and whether they found it beautiful. The working class had quite consistent views. The aged image resonated with them, but they'd say it resembles a family member's or friend's hand, a hardworking hand. But none considered it beautiful. The middle class, like teachers or small merchants, would praise the hand ethically, acknowledging its hard labor. But higher up, hands cease being labor tools.
More upper-class people analyzed the photo aesthetically, with bizarre reasons for finding it beautiful.
Like the light cast on the hand, its color undershadows, even proportional harmony, increasingly distant from the hand's actual function. Theoretically, appreciating photos or choosing decor is just personal preference. But why in reality is there aesthetic hierarchy? with everyone pursuing so-called sophistication.
More interestingly, even colors get ranked. Low saturation grayish tones called Morandi colors became the most popular sophisticated colors recently.
This relates to taste's second characteristic. Bourdieu said appreciating one taste must show aversion to others, and this aversion is usually expressed without reason. Ballet lovers scorn square dancing. Beethoven, Bach listeners avoid Phoenix Legend. Why is taste exclusive? Because exclusivity establishes hierarchy, which creates distinction or segregation. Now, we've initially answered the first question, what is distinction? Distinction uses taste as a standard to separate social classes. Taste is exclusive, and each class exhibits distinct aesthetic preferences. The higher the social class, the more their taste emphasizes form and abstraction. Now let's look at the second question. How is distinction formed? As we mentioned earlier, philosophers believe aesthetic ability is innate or part of human sensibility, not much related to family or education, but Bourdieu's view is completely different. He points out that the formation of taste primarily depends on family and school education, with family playing a more crucial role than school. And here I'll introduce an important concept, cultural capital. When talking about capital, it's easy to think of economic capital, your property, savings, investments, or social capital, your network of relationships. Cultural capital, as proposed by Bourdieu, is a comprehensive disposition including education level, skills in informal interactions, lifestyle habits, attitudes in dealing with people, language style, and so on. Traditional studies on social class often focus on economic or social capital, but Bourdieu points out, contemporary social culture has permeated all areas of society. It's time to view culture as a separate type of capital. In the past, people might have focused on your economic strength, thinking it determines your taste. But now, Bourdieu believes cultural capital is crucial in shaping taste. And to acquire this cultural capital, Bourdieu believes it relies on school education and family education. First, let's talk about school education. Bourdieu's definition of the education system is very unique. He doesn't see schools as institutions for learning knowledge or cultivating talent, but views the education system and its diplomas as important state apparatuses controlling the production and circulation of cultural capital. In his view, the education process is actually a process of social control, but it's indirect and voluntary, not direct and coercive. All the knowledge we acquire in school, Bourdieu calls legitimate knowledge, which is a condensation and summary of human civilization. Simply put, it includes cultural knowledge like humanities, sciences, music, painting, and theories on how to conduct oneself, distinguish right from wrong, and good from evil. Additionally, the progression mechanism from elementary school to university, in a somewhat crude way, ensures the level of overall cultivation. Statistically speaking, the higher the education level, the higher the overall cultivation. A diploma from a prestigious university itself only indicates that you have studied certain courses and obtained a degree. But in society, the information this diploma provides far exceeds that. It can even help you get larger loans from banks, which is the conversion of cultural capital into economic capital. If cultural capital were only acquired through school education, people with the same educational background would have very similar tastes. However, this is far from the case, because cultural capital has another, more important source. That is family education. Here we need to introduce another extremely important concept by Bourdieu, habitus, which is the English term, and in Chinese, it's like reversing the characters for habit. So what is habitus? Habitus is defined as a durable disposition that systematically influences our ways of thinking and behaving on a subconscious level. And the reason for not using the word habit in translation is to emphasize the long time investment required in forming habitus. Changing it is very difficult. Habitus can be very subtle behaviors, what Bourdieu called the most insignificant bodily techniques. For example, Gestures while speaking, posture when walking, even how one blows their nose, the shape of the mouth while eating or speaking. Similarly, habitus can also be very abstract ways of thinking. Take consumption concepts. When a worker hears that a surgeon spent $3 million on his son's engagement ceremony, he wouldn't envy the ceremony but the 2 or 3 million. Because from this worker's deeply ingrained lifestyle, a 3 million engagement ceremony is undoubtedly a waste. Even if he had that 3 million to spend, he'd be thinking about using it elsewhere. Therefore, when the same income is linked to vastly different consumption patterns, the role of habitus becomes very clear. Thus, habitus is an internalized lifestyle, requiring intentional or unintentional imitation and learning, which demands significant time investment. Moreover, it can't be substituted. The learner must practice it themselves, making the family the most crucial place for habitus formation. Bourdieu found that cultural capital can be acquired through family or school education, but these two pathways receive very different social evaluations. What comes through family education, so-called cultivation, is seen as innate talent and pure pleasure, while school-acquired cultural capital is often called bookishness or pedantry. Bourdieu points out that this is a smokescreen set by classes advantaged in family education to consolidate their status. Because habitus formed through family education typically requires more money, time, and effort. For example, take sports-related hobbies. Why does horseback riding feel much more high class than bridge or chess? Because learning horseback riding is typical family education, it requires substantial investment in facilities and horse maintenance, which schools can't provide at scale. Moreover, families send children for equestrian training from young age, a long-term commitment that schools or classes can't match. Therefore, those born into upper society can transform family habitus and inherent economic and social capital into cultural capital, even without formal education. Conversely, those from middle or working classes find their class habitus hinders further cultural capital acquisition despite schooling. 88. Moreover, school-acquired cultural capital faces serious devaluation. A once popular internet term, small-town SWAT, describes rural students entering elite universities through rote learning but struggling academically and facing unemployment after graduation. Small-town SWAT represents a group's bittersweet self-mockery. Their plight reflects how schooling's cultural capital devalues as social classes solidify. This leads us to Bourdieu's personal experience. In today's terms, Bourdieu was essentially a small-town SWAT. He was born to an ordinary family in rural France. His father worked as a village postman. At 20, he entered École Normale Supérieure to study philosophy. École Normale Supérieure has long nurtured French intellectuals. Famous alumni include Sartre, Foucault, and Derrida. Yet at this prestigious institution, Bourdieu constantly felt the gap between himself and elite class students. He noted this difference gradually helped him perceive things others couldn't observe or feel. Remarkably, the institution's free, open, and critical tradition prompted Bourdieu to examine cultural capital, reflect on hidden inequalities, and discover schooling couldn't bridge this gap. Now, we can briefly summarize the answer to the second question. The formation of distinction primarily depends on cultural capital. The accumulation of cultural capital mainly relies on school education and family education. Among these two, habitus fostered by family education has a huge impact on one's behavior and thinking and is decisive for cultural capital's production and accumulation. And after explaining what distinction is and how it forms, we need to answer the third question, the existence of distinction. What does it mean for our society? With Bourdieu's insights on distinction, can we re-examine our own social positions and gain new understanding of phenomena like group buying socialites and small-town SWATs? First, no taste should be sanctified. The distinction in tastes is simply due to different cultural capital across classes, leading to varied aesthetic preferences. For example, in Bourdieu's time, Professors and big businessmen were in the upper class. Professors had the most cultural capital, while big businessmen had the least economic capital. Well, yeah.
So, aesthetically, professors show ascetic traits, like choosing hiking or trekking being most economical financially.
But culturally, professors sneer at the golf resorts businessmen enjoy. Now, let's look at the distinction between the new and old middle classes in France back then. In France, the so-called new middle class mainly came from the tertiary service sector, like fashion experts, fitness trainers, psychologists, TV and radio directors and hosts, newspaper journalists, etc. While the traditional old middle class included teachers, doctors, artists, and craftsmen, since these two groups have different professions, their life tastes differ accordingly. Bourdieu said the new middle class's professions are performative. They sell pleasurable consumer goods, so they promote freedom and individual liberation in life ethics. In contrast, the old middle class sticks to an ethics of production, advocating frugality and restraint. If a fashion editor and a high school teacher have similar incomes, the former is more likely to spend on luxury goods, while the latter might spend on movies, shows, or exhibitions. Secondly, the distinction between high and low tastes is just about ranking the upper class's most common attributes against the lower classes, setting them in opposition. We all know that in ancient China, fair skin was considered beautiful, describing both men and women as having powdered faces and creamy complexions. Why was fair skin considered beautiful? Because the ruling class didn't labor outdoors, avoiding sun and rain, so their skin naturally became fair. But today, sun-kissed skin is considered beautiful. Why? In our busy modern society, most people work indoors, so their skin tends to be fair. However, the wealthy leisure class can frequently vacation and exercise, developing that moderately sun-exposed complexion. Once this contrast is established, people consciously or unconsciously use this standard to elevate themselves and attack others. For example, in modern aesthetics, obesity is seen as a lower-class symbol, interpreted as lacking self-discipline, escalating to personal character attacks. In Bourdieu's era France, surveys found higher classes rarely ate weight-gain foods like potatoes, green beans, or fatty meats, while low-fat, light, non-fattening foods like beef, veal, lamb, and fresh fruits and vegetables dominated the upper-class diet. Why does this happen? Because the lower classes eat more potatoes, pork, etc., needing energy for labor, and these foods fit their budgets? But these foods cause weight gain, so economic inequality suddenly becomes aesthetic inequality, poor and ugly. As a sociologist, Bourdieu exposed this not to endorse it, but to highlight its unfairness. The working class has no reason to feel inferior about their bodies or consider themselves ugly.
Finally, from a cultural capital perspective, social mobility is far harder than imagined.
Why is this? Here we must introduce the book's final key concept. Field, translated from Changic, simplest explanation. Social circles based on professions, domains like art, law, science, politics, education. Each forms its own market valuing its products, e.g., diplomas in education. But in fields outside school, like high society salons, dinner parties, or interviews, credentials aren't highest valued. Instead, social graces and connections matter. If you flaunt diplomas here, you'll get eye rolls and be called bookish. After hearing this, you might suddenly understand. Cultural capital doesn't circulate like economic markets built on unified exchange systems. Money is the universal medium. Watermelon selling profits can buy phones, computers, even theater or opera tickets. Cultural capital differs. Outside its professional circle, it's either unrecognized or severely devalued. This leads to exceptionally difficult social mobility. First, lateral mobility within classes. Transitioning, like professor to businessman, requires immense effort. The professor must build capital in a new field. His original insights get only polite nods from businessmen. Business networks, negotiation tactics, social protocols. If you can't master these, you'll never enter the circle. These require long-term accumulation. It's hard to imagine an established professor quickly adopting business habits effortlessly. Thus, lateral mobility isn't easily achieved. Hence, professor entrepreneurs are exceptionally rare. Of course, lateral mobility isn't just difficult but risky. Why? Because different fields have incompatible tastes that mutually exclude each other. Economic and educational capital not only fail to transfer but may cancel each other out. For example, a professor wanting to become a businessman must adopt business habits. Drinking, vacationing, golfing like businessmen? His original circle would scorn this. Result? He loses capital in his cultural circle. Imagine a professor in cultural circles being called businesslike. Hardly a compliment. Beyond lateral mobility, people care more about vertical mobility, especially upward social movement. On this issue, Bourdieu pays most attention to the middle class, as they work hardest to avoid sliding into the working class while striving to join the elite. To achieve upward mobility, the middle class must first increase their total capital. Plainly speaking, besides earning money, they must expand social connections and enhance cultural capital. However, overnight wealth is rare, so many pin hopes on cultural capital to build relationships.
Thus, the middle class strives to be all-round respectable people. Best education for kids, self-care, proper manners, avoiding being unfashionable or tasteless.
Yet in the game of taste, these efforts often prove thankless. But Bourdieu notes true familiarity manifests as detachment and casualness. Only the elite dare say, Van Gogh bores me. The middle class treats culture too seriously. This seriousness reveals they're ruled by culture, not enjoying or creating it. Most middle class realize they can't transcend classes, so they invest heavily in their children's education. Sadly, as noted earlier, schools provide minimal cultural capital. Family-based capital grows crucial in stratified societies. Even spending fortunes on piano or dance lessons can't change habitus-embedded manners and thinking. Back to group buying socialites. If pooling for luxury experiences satisfies vanity or curiosity, that's one thing. But thinking brand logos or fancy venues grant elite status? That's naive. Never mind habitus betraying you instantly. Elite groups practice endogamy. As the saying goes, matching doors. Upper-class professors and businessmen intermarry to combine cultural and economic capital. These group-buying socialites can't gain upper-class cultural capital through their pooling tactics. Even if they had it, the upper class wouldn't consider this capital exchangeable or worth pursuing. Well, now we can briefly answer the third question about Bourdieu. Through his study of distinction, he shows cultural capital has liquidity like economic capital. It can be exchanged, accumulated, and appreciate or depreciate. So no taste deserves sanctification. Behind taste lies specific class interest struggles. But unlike economic capital, cultural capital circulates mainly within specific circles. Changing circles requires restarting accumulation, making social mobility difficult. Both lateral and vertical mobility become exceptionally hard. Notably, the book's subtitle is A Social Critique of Judgment. Philosophy-savvy listeners will recognize this response to Kant's famous critique of judgment. Exactly as mentioned earlier, Western philosophy traditionally views judgment or aesthetic ability as pure, disinterested expressions of human spirit, but Bourdieu adds social to critique of judgment, exposing the class inequalities behind this supposed disinterest. When facing such inequality, imitating elevated tastes means little personally, as it doesn't remove mobility barriers. When birth-based inequality grows harder to overcome in stratified societies, safeguarding public fairness becomes crucial, like educational equity. Such fairness corrects systemic inequality. A mobile society is a healthy society. All right, that concludes our introduction to distinction. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.